Some of you have probably heard by now me talking about how when I was a kid growing up in Virginia, my family and I would make the trek every summer all the way up to Maine, to the Maine coast, where we would camp, usually in beautiful Acadia National Park. And of course, while we were there, we would always have lobster for dinner. I remember we would always go to this little wharf that wasn't far from our campsite and buy the lobster directly from the lobsterman who had caught them just a few hours earlier that morning. And then I remember how my uncle would cook them in this enormous pot right on the Coleman stove, right out under the Maine sky in the summertime. Of course, lobsters come in all shapes and all sizes, some very small and some much bigger. As a kid, I remember wondering to myself, how exactly does a lobster weighing 1 pound, or maybe 2 pounds or 3 pounds, grow to become a lobster that is as big as 10 pounds or 20 pounds, but it has such a hard shell? How can lobsters grow when they seem not only protected by their hard shell, but also confined by it? I wondered about this for a long time until one day I finally found out how it all happens. When a lobster becomes crowded in its shell and it can't grow anymore, by instinct it travels out to the deep sea looking for a place of safety. And there, in the deep, cold water, it begins to shed its old shell. As you might imagine, this is a dangerous process. The lobster actually has to risk its life because once it loses its shell, it is totally vulnerable. It can be dashed on a reef or eaten by a fish or a seal or some other kind of animal. But at the same time, shedding its shell is ultimately the only way it can grow, the only way it can survive. Staying trapped in the tight shell would cause the lobster's stagnation and eventually its death. And so it has to shed the old shell and grow another. And not just once, but again and again and again over its lifetime. In fact, most of the lifetime of a lobster or a crab, most of its life is spent shedding its shell and growing another, shedding its shell and growing another. This morning's gospel story, this story we just heard from Mark's gospel about Jesus and this Syrophoenician woman who comes in search of healing for her daughter. This story is also, I think, a story about shedding old shells and growth. A story in which Jesus himself grows. Just before today's gospel, you might remember, Jesus has been ministering in Galilee, but then he decides to go away to the region of Tyre, a Gentile region, a region outside of Israel, a foreign place. I can only imagine as Jesus arrives there that he must be exhausted from all of the healing and teaching he's been doing. Maybe he figures that by leaving his own country, people won't bother him anymore. But of course, no sooner has he crossed the border than this poor Syrophoenician woman who has heard about him finds him and throws herself at his feet and begs him to cast out a demon from her sick daughter. Now, we probably expect that Jesus will simply have mercy on this woman. This is always his way with people, isn't it? Even when he is bone tired, even after the longest of days, he always seems to be able to muster compassion for the people around him. But not this time. And not with this woman. You see, his job description, at least the way he understood it, didn't include people like her. He had been sent to his own people, to the house of Israel. The scope of his mission wasn't wide enough to include an outsider, a foreigner, like her. And so how does he respond to her? Well, by as much as calling her a dog, a belittling word used by the people of Jesus' day to describe outsiders to Israel. Let the children be fed first, he tells her, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. How could Jesus possibly address this woman in this way? Here she is, coming to him, believing that he actually has the power to heal her tormented daughter if only he consents. And what does he do? He callously insults her. It is a shocking moment. For me, the most shocking moment in the Gospel of Mark, I think, especially if we thought we knew Jesus. But I have to say, what is just as shocking is how this woman responds. Does she cower and slink away? No. No, she calls him out on his behavior. Although as a man, Jesus has all the power in this encounter, she is a mother and she's desperate. And she will do whatever she needs to find healing for her daughter. And so with great courage, she stands up to him. Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Jesus is used to being confronted by Pharisees and scribes and religious leaders, but this woman, this foreign woman, she catches him completely off guard. And after she is done speaking, I think we can sense something is happening inside of Jesus. Something is shifting. He is actually struck by what she says, struck by the truth of her words. And right there in front of us, we see Jesus in a moment of his own conversion. Here he is, confronted by two children of God, this woman and her very sick daughter. Neither she nor her daughter likely fit into Jesus' framework. They probably don't fit into his past experience either. But when she so boldly confronts him, he realizes, maybe for the first time, that God might just be choosing not only to love the people of Jesus' own background, the people of the house of Israel, his fellow Jews, but everyone, including outsiders, including foreigners, like this woman and her daughter. The breadth and depth of God's love is dawning on Jesus in a new way, right before our very eyes in this gospel story. And we are witnesses to, I think, a pretty extraordinary moment of Jesus' growth. He's beginning to embody those words, that challenge that we heard in the letter to James this morning. We can literally see him having to let go of the tight theological shell that is now too small, too constricting, for his new awareness of the wideness of God's love for the whole world. For saying that, he says to the woman, "You may go. The demon has left your daughter." Where Jesus ends up in this gospel story is not where he began. What we might call his worldview expands. He has to leave his old shell behind. And from this point on in the gospel, he is a changing, growing man. And in changing and growing, he becomes more fully the one God desires him to be, more fully himself, more fully the Christ, whose arms of compassion arms that would not long from now be stretched out in love on the hardwood of the cross, embraced the whole world. This is a story about Jesus and about Jesus' life, yes. But I think it's also very much a story about us and about our life. Because kind of like that lobster going out into the deep to shed its shell so that it may grow, and like Jesus in the gospel story, we too are called to shed our old shells, the shells that no longer fit us. We too are called to let go of our narrow way of seeing things, the world, other people, God. And we too are called to allow ourselves to become vulnerable to change and growth. And not just once, either, but like our lobster friend and like Jesus, again and again and again, as part of our growth and conversion. It is a lifelong process, a process of shedding our old shells. To quote the German poet and novelist Hermann Hesse, the cosmic spirit seeks not to restrain us, but lifts us stage by stage to wider spaces. If we accept a home of our own making, familiar habit makes for indolence. We must prepare for parting and leave-taking, or else remain the slave of permanence. Even the hour of death may send us speeding on to fresh and newer spaces. In the life of faith, the life of following Jesus, there's never a moment when we can say confidently, we've arrived. We're all set. We know everything we need to know about God, about the world, about each other. For the moment we do, like the lobster, we stop growing. We stagnate. And not only do our shells harden, but far, far worse, our hearts. I have a friend, Brother Curtis, who's a monk, who likes to talk about God as the one who is always more. God is always more. More than we can think, more than we can imagine, more than we can experience, always greater. Always more. If God is not greater, Curtis once said, then we run the risk of reverencing only the archives of our experience of God, rather than worshiping the living God who is always more, who creates in us a life longing for more. My friends, that is our calling as people who are struggling and seeking to follow Jesus and to worship the living God. We are called to worship the living God, not the archived God, but the God who is always more, the God who creates in us a life longing for more, the God who calls us, just as Jesus, to wider spaces, the God who bids us to set aside our old shells again and again and again, and to grow and to change, so that we may mature into the measure of the full stature of Christ, who himself changed, his heart broken open in love for the world. Amen.